Okay, I want you to understand where I'm at, but I'm just doing a little brief demonstration of a study place where I'm at based on heritage and family things, right? But I want you to understand how deep this goes. So I'm going to bring you a little bit in. All right. On my grandmother's side, her family, the Famble, come off of Skidaway Island. And they are really born on Skidaway Island. Their history goes back to where they talk about living with Tamachichi on Skidaway Island. So you got to understand what we're talking about right here, right? Now, when we get to the point of that, right? Now, the Native American name that they give to those who supposedly lived on Skidaway Island are Gullah, G-U-A-L-E, also known as the Timucun. So now when you start studying it, now when you go down into the Liberty County, the Sunbury area, from where my grandfather came from, that's also where they coming from, St. Catherine's Island and stuff like that. So they're boatmen. They traveled on the river. They're boat builders. But they are also from an area where they said they are Gullah, G-U-A-L-E, Gullah. Now, so on all of the islands, you have the Gullah. But the Gullah are actually the Shawnee or the Shawnee. S-H-A-W-N-E-E, the Shawnee, right? Now, they are what they call Algonquin, the language that they speak, right? And to many people, they say that that's a foreign, they're foreign, they speak an unintelligible dialect according to the Iroquois. Now, so now you have to understand now, because this is like explaining the history of what's going on in America. So I want you to understand now from this aspect. Now, on my grandfather's side, we always claim from boat builders, we go to Aksum or Aksumite, the great African boat builders, or the great see these in Aksum times they didn't even call themselves African. They said they were world conquerors. You know, they were world empire. They were keepers of God's domain. All right, so that Aksumite lineages came up into Brazil, up into the Americas, and into the islands, supposedly. Okay, I want you to get that straight. Yeah, there were people also still here. So now in understanding this, now you get the Shawnee. Now what happens is in history is the Shawnee have another name, Savannah. The Shawnee are also known as Savannah. Now that's a big thing now. The Savannah is the 13th colony, right? 13, very important number. So now the Shawnee all throughout Carolina, Georgia, into Florida, and they're also up in Ohio. They are tagged in with the Delaware. Those who don't understand about the Delaware tribes, they're also tagged in with the Delaware tribes, and they go all up into Ohio. Everywhere the Shawnee are at, or everywhere the Gullah are at, there are mounds. Now, the other Native American of this land, they have no association or understanding of the mounds. They are not associated with them. Now, the Shawnee, the Gullah, are associated with the mounds. Now, that's very important. See, because on Skidaway Island, they have spiraling mounds. In Brazil, they have spiraling mounds. In Mexico, they have spiraling mounds. You know, even in Mexico, you know, you have people that talk about the Mayans and the Aztecs, but the name they say is Quiche or Quiche or Quiche or Gichi. Quiche, Gichi, Quiche, Gichi. But the Quiche say that they are descendants of Cush, but they are keepers of the serpent, right? So in the finding of the mounds, you also got another name there, Nezach, like the Hebrew letter, but Nezet. They are a tribe and they call them sun worshippers. But also in the concept of understanding that. Now, many of you don't know, and I'm gonna try to show a quick picture because I'm talking, but I want to show this quick picture as well. So let me see if this is the right tab. If this is the right tab, I'll show you a quick picture. Now, what happens is in Georgia, they've also found you study oxen and you find out that oxen had an ancient serpent conceptual worship that ended up transcending into what was later on the dynasty of Queen Sheba, the Makeda, the Queen tribes. So you have to understand what that meant. And it meant in two ways, and it's metaphysical, and it's also understanding the science. Now, let me say this. The Gullah, the Shoni, right? The Gullah and the Shoni are in all of these areas. Now, all these areas are families. From Pinpoint, those who from Pinpoint, White Bluff, Thunderbolt, Sandfly. You got to check this. You have to understand, especially up in Sunbury, Liberty County. We really have to understand who these people are. We really need to know this, right? Because in the end, you have to understand that a lot of us, in the end, were kidnapped from out of these areas, of these islands, and were taken to Carolina and sold in slavery. And then when we got in slavery, see, they treated us just like Africans, right? That were brought over on the ships. Now you have to understand why I say that, because there's two Africans. There's the ones that had already came here prior to a concept of Africa. And there were those that were brought here in the midst of that from Africa directly. But there were some that were being trotted in these lands. So I don't debate with my brothers, the Moors, any of the brothers that say they indigenous to the lands. Yes, there was indigenous concepts of people here. Yes, tribe. So now what happens is, even in the history, and that's why I posted this whole bunch of history about Skidoo Island, the way the European goes around of record keeping, they act like the blacks that are on the island, yes, even though before, like, for someone there for just plantation or slavery, they were families and people on these islands. And they just literally just write them off as though, okay, well, they're just residue of some type of things going on, but they've always been on the island. So there's a lot of things that have to be understood about how they've written us off. Then when you go down into Sunbury, into the Liberty County area, Sunbury Church is built by 40 freedmen. Now you have to understand the concept of freedmen too, because this is Native American and African lineages mixed. That's why we say Gullah. It's the East and the West. It's the East and the West united. So in understanding that, like, there's a lot of hidden history that has been written off. And then when you go to studying the importance of how important it was to deal with the mound builders and to disconnect them then you'll see why the Shawnee were being attacked, and the Iroquois nation was being paid to attack the Shawnee, and they called the Shawnee unintelligible language. But let me tell you what their secret is right here now, right? Because now when I say that, it goes back to an ancient sculpture that they found in Georgia that shows that in Georgia there was a concept of serpent worship in the southeast United States. They've even found relatives of this going down into Florida. But they find the same element, the stone serpent of Kukulkan, as in Mexico, right? So in understanding that, that takes things a little deeper. So what happens is the language Algonquin goes to a word aprofa for the dialect. And let me see where it's at. I just had it open. So it goes for aprofa for the dialect of the Shawnee or the Gullah or the Algonquin, right? Let me see. It's got to be because it went to this word here. Right, because the language that the name of the language for the Shawnee, for the Gullah, is called schema, and it actually is schema for a term that actually means serpent. So what happens is the Shawnee, the Gullah, and they tell you that the Mayans, Aztecs, all the people, and even in the Gullah concept of the circular mounds on Skidoo Island, they always tell you that these people disappeared. But we have blood lineages that lived in these areas. So we didn't disappear. We were right here. All right, so here we go. Okay. Yeah, I think that's something I didn't find the word. I just pulled it up. One of the good books is The Sacred Milestones, Mexico and its Symbolism. Studied in Aksum. The word you would use is Ari, A-R-W-E, also known as Wanabi, W-A-I-N-A-B-A, Wanabi. There's a connection. And you have to understand it. See, what happens is with me, I'm doing the complete research on whatever my elders told me to be able to connect the lineage to the truth of what they said. And based on that, I will be able to hand that to my children and say, you don't have to be a wanderer of your truth. Here is your lineage. This is the direct truth of your lineage. This is your history right here, hidden in the veils of their story, of his story. There is our story. So just a little input. I went a little further than I wanted to. Just hope you enjoyed the information. What I'm going to do is, all you have to do is look at my Facebook posts. You can track all this information I'm saying. And I'm going to put some more information, like how I just tracked the language of the Shawnee of the Gullah to actually being a word that represents serpent. But, as the tribes would cover it up, at first they would just say Now, we don't know who them people is. We don't know how they talk. They're just unintelligible. But the word actually for their language was skimika, skimma. Yes. Serpent, negus, negus, kibra, cobra, gabra nagas, cobra, kings. Bashe. In our history, as we study about the Gullah, the Shawnee, the Gullah, we find that the Gullah were also on Tybee Island. Yes, Tybee Island. Yes, Tybee Island. And then we also know that the largest mound is where Georgia Ports is at, called the Irene Mound. And that, the Gullah are part of this culture, what they call the Mississippian mound builders. So we know who we are. You find the mound builders in Africa. So we understand that that is an ancient tradition that connects us globally. So we are not just borders or nationality. We are actually keepers of the planet. Now, when we studied that the Gullah were actually on Tybee, there's actually a part of the story that's never really told. So I'm going to read a little bit to get the story out. Before General Oglethorpe stepped foot in Georgia, the Gullahs were there. The Gullah were a Native American tribe. Before Oglethorpe made development, it was called the Debatable Lands. The British in Charleston, the Spanish based in St. Augustine, and the French in the West pushing eastward all laid claim to this land. The Native Americans already here were not included in this discussion. So this is how you have to understand Georgia history, what's really going on around here, right? So you got British, Spanish, so you got to understand you're trying to choose who's going to let you be able to handle your land without the least amount. So that's why the stories are always confusing on who the Native American, because some tribes was working with this side because they were told they would get this benefit. Some tribes chose to work with this side, then they realized that this side was crossing them out, so they doubled back and went and worked with the other side. Then in the end, both of the tribes who got crossed out united, then they became known as rebellious, the Yamasee. So that's why the stories are always confusing on who the Native American, because some tribes was working with this side because they were told they would get this benefit. Some tribes chose to work with this side, then they realized that this side was crossing them out, so they doubled back and went and worked with the other side. Then in the end, both of the tribes who got crossed out united, then they became known as rebellious, the Yamasee. So it was a lot of confusion in those times, so we confused the history, and then later on we're educated away from it by ourselves and by those who took control of us. So what happens is the Spanish tried to lay claim to the land, Tybee Island, Georgia, Savannah, as they did on the West Coast with missions. So they send in the priests first, to act as though they're coming on a mission to bring them out. And on the East Coast, they established missions up from St. Augustine in Florida. They worked with the Native Americans to establish missions, some saying all the way to Port Royal, South Carolina. One of the missions was on Tybee Island. In Georgia, the Spanish used the tribe Gullah, whose territory ranged on the coast of Georgia, helped them establish missions on several of the Georgia coastal barrier islands: Sea Island, St. Catherine, Sapelo, Ossabaw, Warsaw, and Tybee Island. Now listen, my mom and them always say, even though my grandfather and them was Geechee, somehow they was educated. They knew English, they could read. So it was like, these families were in these missionary areas, on these, what they would later on try to act like they was in plantational areas, but they were in their tribal areas. Some of them got kidnapped from these areas at this time. Now listen what happens now. In Georgia, the Spanish used the tribe, the Gullahs, as a tribe. The Gullahs were already established here since the 11 or 30s BC. At least would eventually be identified with the great Mississippian culture, the Irene Mounds, which most people have heard about, The Mississippian Indians had a chieftains and are known as mound builders, so that's why they put us with the Mississippian mound builders. Or instead of saying Mississippian mound builders, could be with us. The French, who made mode of expansion was through the establishing of trading posts, first met with the Gullahs. So what the French would do is come in and buy furs and try to trade heavily and pay good price. This is how a lot of the tribes became mixed, lighter, because in honoring of the trading together, what a lot of the chiefs or the traders would do is they would allow the traders or the fur traders to marry one of their daughters, as you know, that's how we did amongst ourselves, as in a peace agreement and that. And in those ways, these people became part of a tribal family. Later on, when Europeans came in with full power, those was the families that they first went to deal with. And those were the families that negotiated the power away from those who were not of that outer realm. So this is what's going on in Georgia. This is why the technicality of who is who and what is what gets confusing, and how did they get this. So when you understand this, then you understand how there came about a person named William McIntosh in the Georgia history. But let me read a little further. The Gullahs had their numbers decreased due to major epidemics in the late 17th centuries and 18th centuries. The British took notice of this. The British were uncomfortable with the Spanish population so close to their lands in South Carolina. British was in South Carolina, which they had designed to start colonies. So they joined with one of the friendly tribes, the Westistos, to remove the Gullahs from what was Georgia. So what they did was took another tribe and they started attacking the Gullah. They started attacking us, right? Running us out of the area. So now what happens is tribal people get spread apart, and some families remain hidden out in some areas and some don't. Some of them, that's where we get Gullah. Some remain out in the islands on the coast and some don't. And then when a lot of the slaves would run away, they would be taken in by those who are already out of there, who we call the Gullah or the Gullah, because they were also Kichi, Quichi, Geechee. Understand this now. Learn this. So they sent the Westistos to attack and remove the Gullahs from Georgia. With the assistance of 300 Westizo warriors, they attacked the Spanish missions on the coast of Georgia. Eventually, they were able to destroy the missions and accomplish their mission by 1702. With the missions destroyed, some of the Gullah removed to Spanish territories in Florida. So this is where you start getting Yamasee and Seminole and Yamasee. That's why they try to say they don't know if Seminole and Yamasee is Creek or Shawnee. They can't figure them out. But then they come back and you have to use a language thing with them, right? And it comes back. Then that's when they start using the term Yamasee, right? Because what happens is, even though the Gullah run to Florida, in this Florida area, and they mad with Florida or the Spanish, and they would later on even join with some of the Westillos who were mad with the British for tricking on them and seeing all of this, and then they became what's called the Yamasee. Now, the Yamacraw, what they called, was the chief of Tomachichi, which was working with the British. He was working with the British and helped them settle into Savannah. Now, this is how you got to understand. That means that Yamasee or the Yamacraw, Wastitos, were Uchi, but Yamacraw, but that's why they tell you got Creek, Yamacraw, you got all this mixture. So on the eastern coast, there's a whole lot of things going on different than the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Dakota, even though they were having the same problems by marrying in the first traders that came in, because that became another way in. That's where the Lewis and Clark expedition really hit us hard, because they were able to map the routes unto the certain tribes, like the Shawnee and the Gullah. They knew where we at, they knew our strongholds, so they're able to map and plot against us. Thank you, what the brother is, Ali, who took Lewis and Clark and showed them the ways. If you look at in Spanish missions, this is what happens in the Gullah areas. They have Santo Domingo, and what happens is, now you have to understand this is, and this is in understanding is why in Pinpoint we were raised and called Pinpoint area Beulah, Cuba. You have to understand what that meant, because it was a lot of connections going back and forth in Cuba and the Haiti, Cuba areas and all that. But the Gullah became a memory and people forgot all about that history, and it died down, and they stopped speaking about who the Gullah or what the Gullah were. They didn't understand that. All right, so let me get this last little good point here. I'm looking at this because I want you to understand that all of the indigenous people of the world are doing a return of stolen land. A return of stolen land. Now, when we study this history on who we are and what we are, and we were rightful keepers of this area, of this zone, we have to understand that in 1825 there was a treaty signed. Yes, there was a treaty signed by William McIntosh in Georgia, an Indian treaty, 1825, by William McIntosh. Look it up, for Georgia. But it was a fraudulent representation of the Creek, of the Shawnee, of the Gullah, of the tribal chieftains. And in that signature, he signed away Georgia, the coastal islands, Alabama. He signed them all away. And because of that, in 1818, there was created the Code of 1818, and the lawmenders, the law keepers, the protectors of the treaties and the protectors of the indigenous rights was created. And because of his treason against that order and against that, William McIntosh was sentenced to death. This is public record. Under the lawmenders in the Code of 1818, William McIntosh had committed treason and fraud, and he had fraudulently signed a treaty that gave away the jurisdiction of Georgia. And it is a known public record. So Georgia is really stolen land. And in the end, as all things stolen, it will have to be returned. And the saga continues.